I would say that unquestionably, I am an American, born there. My father slaved there. Upon the backs of my people was developed the primary wealth of America, the primary wealth. You have to have accumulated wealth to start, to build. You did it another way here in Australia. You had to build your accumulated wealth too. You just came and took it. You know what I mean? And that's what they did in most of the countries. That's what you Europeans did. You just took it. We got to catch up with you a little bit. And so in America. So there's a lot of America that belongs to me yet. You understand? But just like a Scottish American is proud of being from Scotland, I'm proud for being African. Now, in our school books, they tried to tell me that all Africans were savages till I got to London and found most of the Africans I knew were going to Oxford and Cambridge and doing very well and learned their culture. And even once somebody had the temerity, after one had conquered the Chinese people and imposed upon them the opium trade and everything else, to suggest that they were a backward people, just the people who had been civilized so long over the rest of you folks didn't make any sense at all. So somewhere it was wonderful to find about the colored peoples of the world that they were very advanced. So I would say today that I'm an American who is infinitely prouder to be of African descent, no question about it. No question about it. I'm an Afro-American, and I don't use the word American ever loosely again.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I'm here with my co-host, Seamus Malakafzeli, along with our producer, M. Siniza. We're recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. As cracks spread across the edifice of U.S. unipolar power, new geopolitical arrangements are starting to form, with states positioning themselves with respect to an as-of-yet unidentified emerging global order. Although these moves are responding to new conditions, the people making this history do not, in the words of Karl Marx, make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past. Indeed, Marx writes in the 18th Brumaire, quote, "The tradition of all dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just as they seem to be occupied with revolutionizing themselves and things, creating something that did not exist before, precisely in such epochs of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language."
The specter of Pan-Africanism and its left-wing roots still hold importance for many, with military coups over the past decade in Mali, Niger, and in particular Burkina Faso, sustaining their popularity in part by invoking the memory of past revolutionary leaders like Thomas Sankara, and speaking of shaking off their colonial masters in Paris, even as they continue to entrench military cooperation with the United States through AFRICOM.
But the story of Pan-Africanism and the left does not start with Sankara, or even the revolutionary figures of the African independence movements from a generation before, like Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and Patrice Lumumba of the Congo. To tell this story, we have to go back 100 years, to a period in which the world was in a state of crisis not wholly unfamiliar today.
In the period following the Russian Revolution and the establishment of the USSR, the Communist International, aka the Third International, or more commonly known as the Comintern, was set about by Lenin to establish the conditions for the overthrow of global capitalism and the liberation of workers worldwide. Therefore, borders were much less of a concern than they were before.
For those early communists, the task necessarily involved direct engagement with the various national struggles underway across the colonized world, and even subnational struggles from within the imperialist powers, namely the Black liberation struggle in the United States. At the same time, Black radicals in the US and elsewhere began to think about their own liberation in international terms. These included Marcus Garvey, whose life and thought we discussed in our episode Black Internationalism with Adam Getachew, which you should definitely go listen to if you have not done so.
Other thinkers and organizers of that era understood their project as more explicitly left-wing. These figures, like Harry Haywood and George Padmore, participated directly in the Comintern, actively seeking to steer it in a more Pan-Africanist direction, while simultaneously pushing the movement for Black liberation toward communism as its guiding light.
Though that particular moment of ideological formation and transformation would largely be supplanted by the emergent dynamics of the Cold War, the questions it posed around the interrelation of race and class and the interrelation of the struggles against colonialism and against capitalism carried throughout the 20th century and have persisted into the 21st.
To revisit that historical moment and to trace the story up through the present juncture, we are joined today by the illustrious Hakim Adi.
Hakim Adi describes himself as a former academic. He was, in 2015, the first person of African descent to become a professor of history in the United Kingdom. He is the founder of the Young Historians Project and the author of a number of books on African history and Pan-Africanism, including Pan-Africanism and Communism, the Communist International, Africa and the Diaspora, 1919 to 1939, which has recently been reissued by 1804 Books.
Before we get into the conversation, we do have a pitch to you, the listener. Turbulence is entirely listener-funded. We don't run ads. We don't take money from institutions. And that independence is the foundation of this project. It only exists because of you.
Because we're committed to providing you the in-depth history and present context you need to make sense of each of these topics, these episodes take a great deal of time and effort to produce, from conception to research to editing. It's because we value your time as a listener, and because we want to produce something lasting and useful, that we think this level of effort is worth investing in. But that means we can't quite move as nimbly as we might otherwise like. So in addition to our free public episodes, we're also dropping weekly episodes behind the paywall. That's where we'll be able to respond to events as they unfold in closer to real time, providing our analysis, following up on threads and conversations from prior episodes, and drawing connections across the topics we've covered.
To do all this, we need your support. A $5 monthly subscription will give you access to the bonus feed, our Substack community, and most importantly, you'll make it possible for us to keep doing this work independently week after week. Subscribe today at turbulencepod.substack.com and follow along on Twitter and Instagram at turbulence_pod. We hope you'll join us.
Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Hakim Adi. Dr. Hakim Adi is a historian and a former academic. He is the author of several excellent books, including Pan-Africanism and Communism, the Communist International, which has been reissued in a new edition by 1804 Books. Dr. Adi, thank you so much for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks for inviting me.
So I'd like to begin with how you became a historian, because in your case, that seems to have begun well before the university. You have spoken before about being a voracious reader at a young age, for instance, reading Fanon at 13 or 14 years old. And then you spent a considerable portion of time traveling through Nigeria at 18 before beginning at university. Looking back, how did that experience shape you as a researcher? Did encountering the continent outside of the representations that were available to you in Britain influence how you approached your work and the histories that you would later write?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I've never been asked that before. I think going to Nigeria it had a major influence on me in the sense that I kind of reconnected with my family that had been disconnected from for most of my life, over 50% of my life at that time, for the last 10 years. So that was important in kind of re-grounding me or re-situating me, you could say. I think the experience probably made me more, in a strange way, critical and wary of Eurocentrism in general. I think I was probably a little bit wary of it, although I didn't fully know what it meant or wouldn't have referred to it in those terms. But yeah, it assisted in making me more critical of those things I would learn when I returned to London and went to university to study African history for 3 years. So it didn't give me necessarily specifics, but it kind of rounded me and grounded me and gave me the perspective, I think, to be more critical of many of the things that I was to be taught in London.
So I was wondering if we could start this historical survey, right at the beginning of the Soviet Union's existence. Could you detail for listeners what was the relationship that Marxists and Pan-Africanists had in that interwar period? What relationship did they have with the Comintern that Lenin had set up? And when did people like George Padmore start breaking with that Soviet framework?
Well, I suppose that the first thing to say is that Africans, people of African heritage, came to Marxism from different perspectives, depending on where they were in the world. Even before the founding of the Communist International, there were those in Africa who were interested in Marxism, were interested in socialism, as there were in the United States, in the Caribbean and some other places. So those who were concerned about liberation and empowerment in general kind of were already exploring these important political questions, even before the founding of the Communist International. The Communist International was important because it, if you like, I suppose, consolidated the Marxism of Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. So it sort of ushered in and consolidated the Marxism of the age of imperialism, of mature or over-mature capitalism, if you like, capitalism in the period of revolutionary outbreaks and so on. And the key thing about the Russian Revolution, as far as Africa and the diaspora is concerned, is that it was a new dawn, a new age was dawning. And it became evident to numerous people. We can take perhaps an example of the African Blood Brotherhood in the United States, mainly based in New York, and made up of, we can say, radical African Americans, although many of them actually were migrants from the Caribbean, but we can say militant, radical Black activists and others. This overthrowing of capitalism in Russia, one of the biggest empires at that time, showed that a different world was possible, that possibly this new world without capitalism could spread or could be made to spread. And so naturally they were very interested in this new world, or the possibilities of this new world. On the other hand, the Communist International was founded on the principle, one of its principal criteria for joining was opposition to colonial rule. And in fact, it was one of the few, probably actually the only international organization at that time, which had both an anti-colonial platform and an anti-racist platform. And within a very short time, it concerned itself with not only the problem of African liberation, but the more general issue of the liberation of the African diaspora as well as the African continent. And even in its very early years, there were some discussions on these questions. One of the things which the Communist International and the analysis of Lenin, who led the Russian Revolution and politically led the founding of the Communist International, was an analysis of imperialism, that is to say, the monopoly stage of capitalism. And his analysis was that essentially that the development of capitalism in different countries was uneven, and that this capitalist system of states could be breached at its weakest link. And that weakest link could be not necessarily in the most advanced capitalist countries, but perhaps in a colonial country or a semi-colonial country, which was the expression people used at that time. And just as in the Russian Revolution, those in the rural areas of Russia were just as important as the workers in the industrial centers, so Lenin's analysis of imperialism was that those in the kind of colonies, if you like, the kind of rural parts of the imperialist system of states, their struggles could be just as important. In other words, the anti-colonial struggle was just as important as the struggle in the so-called advanced capitalist countries. And so this analysis meant that the anti-colonial struggle became extremely important to organize internationally, and therefore the countries of Africa, as well as those in the Caribbean and elsewhere, other parts of Asia and so on, became extremely important. And the other thing which is quite interesting about Lenin, which is perhaps something that isn't well known, is that Lenin also wrote, although not a great deal, but also wrote about the US and the position of African Americans in the US and so on. So there were a number of factors that aligned themselves. The concerns of the Communist International, the concerns of Africans struggling against colonial rule, the concerns of those in the Caribbean and elsewhere, as well as those struggling for liberation and empowerment that were impressed and enthusiastic about the Russian Revolution and its aftermath. And very early on, particularly from those countries where these interests coincided, for example, in the United States, some people joined the communist movement or the communist parties that existed at that time. Others formed organizations like the African Blood Brotherhood, which had a almost immediate sympathy towards the Russian Revolution and the politics of the Communist International. So all of this, to summarize without kind of reciting my whole book, which I can't remember anyway in detail, all this to say that there was a kind of synergy between the aims of the Communist International and its communist parties and the aims of various activists, some of whom were within the communist movement and some of whom were outside it. And this led to, very early on, the Communist International developing a policy on what it called the Negro question. The Negro question is really the question of how Africa and its diaspora would achieve liberation. And in those discussions, representatives of communist parties in Africa were represented, representatives of those who were concerned with these issues in the US, for example, were involved. And that included people like Otto Huiswald, who was a Surinamese activist and one of the founding members of, or founders of communism, we can say, in the United States. So they took part in these discussions. The Communist International developed a policy on this Negro question, where they essentially recognized that the question of the liberation of Africa and the liberation of those of African heritage internationally, whether in the Caribbean or South America or Europe and so on, were related questions. They were interconnected questions. They weren't exactly the same issue, but they were interconnected questions. And so, to put it in a simple way, the Communist International took a Pan-African perspective on this question and began to develop its policies and to develop various plans to hold an international conference on these questions and so on and so forth. In the course of those discussions, various meetings that took place, other organizations were formed that were concerned with anti-colonialism, anti-racism. One of the most important was the League Against Imperialism, which was formed in 1927 in Brussels. And at that meeting, various African, Caribbean, African-American activists got together under the auspices of the Communist International, we can say, and further discussed this question and so on. And not all of them were members of communist parties. There were representatives there of the African National Congress in South Africa, for example, and others. In the course of these ongoing discussions which the Communist International had, it began to attract those who were concerned with liberation and empowerment to join the communist parties that existed. So, for example, the Communist Party in the United States, the Communist Party of South Africa, the Communist Party of France, the Communist Party of Britain, and others. From these organizations, and at the urging of black communists, the Communist International, its trade union organization, which is generally known as the Red International of Labor Unions, or the Prof in turn, set up an organization which had a rather long title, the International Trade Union Committee of Negro Workers, which was formed in 1928. And the aim of that organization was essentially to encourage and prod the communist parties, the members of the Communist International, to accelerate their work on the Negro question, as it was called. So the British Party, the French Party, the South African Party, the American Party, why weren't they doing more? Why were they not recruiting more black members? Why were they not organizing in the colonies? Why were they not organizing amongst black South Africans? Why were there so few African American members? These kinds of questions and issues. And that organization had a publication, and it held its own international conference, which was held in 1930 in Germany. So amongst the key figures of that organization were people like Otto Huyswoud, George Padmore, originally from Trinidad, but who had joined the American Communist Party, and others that I won't go on to mention. So that international committee became based in Hamburg in Germany for reasons I won't go into now. And during the early 1930s, George Padmore was the secretary of it. It attempted to organize in various parts of the world, particularly where these communist parties existed. It clandestinely disseminated its publication, which was called Negro Worker, and so on and so forth. And it achieved some successes, we could say. I mean, I think the second part of your question was why George Padmore became dissatisfied with all of that.
I did, yeah.
That's also quite a complicated issue, which again I go into great detail in my book. But I think to give you a short answer, because I've already given you a very long answer, the short answer is that Padmore was the secretary of the International Trade Union Committee, and so had quite a lot of some autonomy in how he operated. But he began to organize with a little too much autonomy as an individual rather than part of a collective. Obviously, he was answerable to others on the basis of the way that communist parties operate, democratic centralism. He was supposed to report, he was supposed to do certain things and so on. And he didn't like to do them and wanted to operate much more as an individual. He did some things without authority. He was lax in terms of security precautions, and it was particularly important in Hamburg because historically this was the time when the Nazis came to power, and Padmore was actually arrested by the Nazis and deported from Hamburg. And much of the material of the International Committee, including names, addresses, etc., was confiscated by the Nazis and divided up between them and the British government. So there were a number of things Padmore was not doing as he should have done. And he, I think, sought a greater autonomy for this International Trade Union Committee than the Comintern or those who were supporting him and supervising him thought was appropriate. Secondly, he was very closely connected with various individuals, or a particular individual in France who was about to be expelled from the French Communist Party for embezzlement and various other things. And he refused to break that political connection, which also created all kinds of difficulties. And then the third thing is that he was a member of a Communist Party, technically a member of the American Communist Party, and under its discipline. And as had happened to his predecessor, that Communist Party, in consultation with the Communist International, could recall him at any time and say, well, we think you spent long enough in Hamburg. Actually, we need you to do X, Y, and Z in wherever. And he refused to do that. So he refused to return to the US. He refused to return to the Soviet Union. He refused to do many things he was asked to do. And so that led to effectively his dismissal from the positions he held. And around the same time that he was going to be dismissed, he said he was resigning, and then began to make public criticisms of the Communist International and so on. So that is the shortest answer I can give to the question.
Thank you. I mean, that was just a really fantastic overview. I'd like to return to a bit earlier in the interwar period, because you mentioned that there was a recognition on the early Soviet side about the interconnections of the issue of class-based struggle and these various national questions, or the international iteration of the national question, as what you refer to as the Negro problem. But I'm curious about the visions of that connection coming from the side of the African diaspora, right? Because it seemed like in the 1920s, there was a recognition among Black radicals in the United States that the issues of class and the struggle for an egalitarian society necessarily moved through this question of the Negro problem. Du Bois, writing in the 1920s, calls the Negro problem, quote, the great test of the American socialist. But it was also recognized by figures like Marcus Garvey, who, while not like necessarily associated with the left per se, still regarded Lenin with deep reverence. But you write that at the time, neither one of these thinkers really had a viable program to offer that could resolve this question as a part of a broader revolutionary project. But then you have a figure like Harry Haywood come along, who seemed to have a synthesis that connects the particular subjugation of Black people in the United States with a broader story about the workers' struggle against capitalism. Can you explain a bit Harry Haywood's Black Belt Thesis, why he developed it, and how it differed from some of the other currents of Black politics at the time?
Well, I can try. The Black Belt Thesis, again, came out of these discussions that were being held in the Communist International and in the American Communist Party itself. It's probably useful to say something a little bit about the background in the American Communist Party, which up until about 1930 had been riven, if that's the right word, by factions fighting against each other and having slightly different views on all kinds of things. So that's quite important. But in general, I suppose the view of many African-American communists, as well as many other communists in the Communist International itself, was that the American Communist Party hadn't paid enough attention to the Negro question in the United States. That is to say, the oppression faced by African Americans, particularly those in the southern states, but in the United States as a whole. It hadn't done enough to recruit them, and it hadn't done enough to understand the nature of struggle in which they were engaged and how it related to, if you like, the overall struggle for liberation and empowerment in the United States. So that's the kind of background to it. So then out of that comes the Black Belt Thesis, which is associated with Harry Haywood, who was an African-American communist, but was jointly developed within the Communist International. And Harry Haywood was part of that and became its greatest champion, but was not solely responsible for it, if I can say that. The essence of the argument, or the essence of the thesis, was that what we can call the democratic revolution in the United States, that is to say, the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, was uncompleted or was incomplete. And that struggle had to be taken through to its conclusion. And one of the ways in which it hadn't been completed was the status of African Americans. Obviously, at that time, particularly rural, many engaged in sharecropping, in living in all kinds of forms of exploitation and oppression at that time, and so on. And that this constituted a particular arena of struggle, we can say, and shouldn't just be something that was minimized with the kind of general idea that, okay, well, there's just a class struggle, and then one day there'll be a revolution, and then all these things will be resolved. But rather that this was a particular form of struggle which had, if you like, it had its revolutionary potential, but that African Americans, particularly within the southern states, were akin to a nation within a nation. And other people have used that expression. Du Bois used it. Martin Delany used it. Others had referred to it. So it was a peculiar status that perhaps didn't exist anywhere else, but it needed resolving. And the resolution of it would play a very, very important part in the overall struggle for liberation and empowerment of all working people in the United States. And connected with that was a very important part of it was the issue of self-determination. And if you say that a people, so African Americans within those states, were a majority population and were a kind of a nation, if they're kind of a nation, then it has to have some kind of self-determination. And if you say that a nation has rights to self-determination, then that has to also include the right to secession. So this idea that African Americans in the southern states could actually raise a demand of seceding from the United States strikes people as a little bit strange, perhaps. But as I say, it has to be seen within the context of the time. It may not be applicable today, but it was seen as being applicable then by some. The other thing I think is worth saying is, what does self-determination mean? Self-determination means people have the right to determine their own lives, how they should govern themselves. They should be empowered to take decisions about their lives. That certainly is something which still exists today. Everybody should have that right. But at that time, it was seen as something that was particular to the African American population. And Haywood developed other aspects of this question, for example, issues connected with culture and history and so on. But I think one of the things which it highlighted at the time was the need for the American Communist Party to take this issue seriously, to take African American struggle in general seriously, to take issues related to African American history and culture more seriously, to recruitment of African Americans and so on. And so from that point of view, it was a very positive development. And one can say that the concentration that the American Party then was encouraged to put on this question, you could say created many of the conditions for the struggle for civil rights and so on that broke out 20 years later in the 1950s and 1960s.
I'm wondering if you could speak about how Pan-Africanism evolved in the wake of the formal decolonization, when all of these struggles now find form in these new countries. How did it respond to neocolonialism from former colonial masters, and how successful were these proposals for confederations, particularly in places like West Africa? I mean, did they pave a vision that you think could have survived long-term had different decisions been made?
Well, up until the 1950s, Pan-Africanism was mainly a movement of non-governmental activists and organizations. Obviously, anti-colonial activism, anti-racist activism, and so on. People organizing jointly to try and advance the interests of Africans and people of African heritage, wherever they might be. But from the 1950s in particular onwards, you had a new situation emerging with the independence, the formal political independence of African states. And obviously that development accelerated during the 1960s. And the first manifestation of that were the various conferences that were held, All African Peoples Conference, which was, we can say, a Pan-African conference held in Ghana in 1958, and the Conferences of Independent African States that was also first held in Ghana in 1958 and then in other countries. And that latter, that Organization of Independent African States, led in 1963 to the founding of the Organization of African Unity, which became the body, the umbrella organization of independent African states. And generally speaking, all the countries of Africa were members of the Organization of African Unity. So clearly this was a very significant form of Pan-Africanism, but it was a creature of its time. That is to say, many of these independent African states, we can say, were independent in name only, and they were still subject to all kinds of ties and pressures and undermining from the big imperialist powers, not only the former colonial powers, such as the British, French, Belgians, Portuguese, and so on, but also the United States, and of course in time from Soviet Union and others. So it's a very complicated period. Also the period of the bipolar division of the world, the Cold War between East, West, and so on and so forth. And so these new African states had to maneuver in this very sticky terrain, and particularly to unite together for the independence of the entire continent, because in the 1960s, 1970s, some countries in the African continent, particularly those occupied by settlers of European origin under the rule of Portuguese colonialism, under the rule of South Africa, for example, were still not independent. And so one of the key considerations of the Organization of African Unity was to unite in order to find ways to bring about the liberation of the entire continent. But in that coming together, various compromises had to be found. And one of the compromises was that countries with very different political orientations had to find ways of working together. There were those countries like Ghana, Guinea, Algeria perhaps, and a few others that had previously been part of a group which is often known as the Casablanca Group, which had a more, shall we say, radical perspective on what was needed to advance African interest, to advance African unity. And the most well-known amongst them was Kwame Nkrumah, the president, formerly prime minister of Ghana, who put forward a view of the need for African unity in a federal form. In other words, a United States of Africa. And his main argument was that if Africa didn't unite, it would be more easily manipulated by the imperialist system of states. It would not be able to utilize economies of scale in terms of its economic development. And he put forward a whole series of arguments, most cogently in his book, Africa Must Unite. But many other countries in Africa did not agree with this analysis for a whole variety of political reasons. For some, because they were still under the influence of the big imperialist powers. And of course, there were also various personal rivalries and tensions and so on and so forth as to who would lead such a United States of Africa and so on. So this was one proposal. Then there were others that thought there should be looser federation or looser joining together of countries within the looseness of the Organization of African Unity. Others who thought there should be more regional groupings, regional economic groupings and federations and so on. In some areas, these regional federations were developed of one sort or another. But I think it's easy to be critical of the Organization of African Unity. It's easy to be critical of the neo-colonial nature of most, if not all, of these governments. But the fact is that this organization came together and did successfully combine for the removal of settler colonialism in Africa, for the liberation of South Africa, liberation of Namibia, liberation of Guinea-Bissau, Angola, Mozambique, and so on. That's a major step forward. So yes, there was neocolonialism, there was compromise, but the OAU fulfilled one of its main objectives.
Something that interests me and interests Dylan, I think, is how Pan-Africanism becomes really integrated with the movement for Palestine in the latter half of the 20th century. I mean, Palestine, there are groups that are left-wing and communist, like the PFLP, like the DFLP, but there are other organizations which do not align itself with leftism, like the Soviet Union did. But it still becomes this major lantern for Pan-African groups like the Black Panthers and others. Can you describe how places like Algeria became such a base for Pan-Africanism? How did other Pan-African movements become so enamored with the Palestinian cause?
Well, let me deal with Algeria first. Algeria was a very, very important country. It's important because of its size, but it's also important because of the struggle it waged to end colonial rule. Algeria fought against French colonialism in essence, for many years before, but particularly from 1954 to 1962, so for 8 years. And in those 8 years, it's estimated that probably something like 1.5 million lost their lives. 3 million were in concentration camps or displaced and so on. So it's an enormous struggle against French colonialism that had ramifications across the continent. And it's not surprising that only last year, Algeria was the host of a major conference to demand that colonialism should be recognized as a crime against humanity, which will hopefully soon be taken up by the African Union. So Algeria has played a very important role in that sense. Of course, it gave rise to the prominence of Frantz Fanon, who kind of almost embodied Pan-Africanism in his being as somebody who came from the Caribbean, from Martinique, but then went to Algeria and became part of the liberation struggle and a major representative of the FLN in the course of that struggle. So when Algeria became independent, it naturally, one would say, it became a kind of bastion of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism. It gave aid and support to many liberation movements in Africa. And it's worth actually mentioning that all of the countries in North Africa, or particularly Algeria, Morocco, Libya, Egypt, all played a very important role in the liberation struggles of other countries of Africa, hosted liberation movements that were banned in their countries of origin and so on. And so it was one of those countries which also appealed to the Black Panther Party, or in particular a certain section of it. And the Black Panther Party was very much influenced by the revolutionary struggles that were going on in the world at that time, not just in Africa, but also in Asia and also in Latin America. So the Panthers were influenced by Cuba, by the Cuban Revolution, the Algerian struggle, obviously the liberation struggle in China, DPR Korea, and elsewhere. But some of the Panthers, particularly the Cleavers and others, came to Algeria In fact, Eldridge Cleaver came to Algeria from Cuba and sought a base for a kind of international HQ or international base for the Panthers in Algeria, which after a lot of wrangling, they managed to achieve for, I think, about 3 years during that time. So I think the point to emphasize there is that Algeria was seen as a revolutionary center in this period in the 1960s. Many people gravitated towards it, including the Panthers. And of course, at that time, there were splits within the Panthers. And so it became quite an important base for Eldridge and Kathleen Cleaver and others during a difficult period of the party's history. And then in relation to Palestine, I mean, the question of Palestine has quite an interesting history as far as Pan-Africanism is concerned. I like to focus a lot of my discussions on Pan-Africanism in 1945, at the time of the Manchester Pan-African Congress. And at that Congress, one of the slogans in one of the most famous photos of the Congress is Arabs and Jews unite against British imperialism, which is a clear reference to Palestine at that time, before Israel even existed. And so Pan-Africanism has a tradition of, we can say, of internationalism, of being concerned with the struggles not just of people of African heritage, but also of Asian heritage, of whatever heritage, of seeing the fact that there's one world and therefore one struggle, as we'd say today, and that these struggles are different aspects of the same struggle. So that concern with Palestine goes back at least to the 1940s, probably to the 1930s. And then in more recent years, it was adopted by those in the 1960s, by the Panthers, before the Panthers by Malcolm X and others associated with the Pan-African movement. And then particularly the Palestinians were present actually in Algiers. They were invited to the 6th Pan-African Congress in Dar es Salaam in 1974 and so on. But I think more than whatever official connections there may or may not be, I think what is important is the perspective that if you are for the liberation of Africa, then you must be for the liberation of Palestine. If you're against the imperialist system of states, then you must be against Israel and Zionism. I mean, I think it's as simple as that. And I don't think one needs to look much further than that. Anyway, and we can see that playing out in various ways historically. But I think that's the issue on Palestine.
I'm curious, just to follow up on that, if there is a legacy of thinkers within the broader Pan-African tradition who were trying to grapple with the distinctions among different colonial forms, right? And I'm thinking in particular about the case of settler colonialism in particular, or settler colonial forms of domination, as opposed to forms of external domination in Africa and elsewhere. I mean, it just made me think of it the way you were talking about the status of Black people in the United States as a kind of like quasi-national population. And part of my question is influenced by the observation that the history of solidarity with Palestine is so present, but it also seems like sometimes there's a flattening among these different forms of domination that make solidarity in terms of thinking about strategies of resistance somewhat different, right? Because the struggle in South Africa and Algeria and Palestine take different forms as national liberation or anti-colonial struggles elsewhere. Is there a history of thinking about the particular cases of settler colonial domination within like the broader Pan-Africanist intellectual movement?
Yes, there is. I mean, the issues that we talked about earlier in regard to the Black Belt Thesis, for example, within the Communist International, if we're thinking about that as a Pan-African perspective, it also raised the question of the orientation of the struggle in South Africa and what its orientation should be. And the key thing there was that the emphasis must be on organizing amongst the majority of the population. I think the whole kind of tradition of struggling against settler colonialism in Africa the tradition is not necessarily one of struggling against settlers, but against the imposition of colonial rule through settlers, if you like, to put it that way. So the struggle in Algeria, the struggle in Guinea-Bissau, the struggle in Mozambique, the struggle in Namibia, the struggle in South Africa are similar struggles in the sense that a particular form of colonialism was imposed on those countries and they needed to find ways of dealing with it. And that is not dissimilar to the nature of settler colonialism in Palestine. And it has the imperialist system of states supports the creation of settler colonialism and the continuation of settler colonialism in occupied Palestine, just as it did in South Africa and Namibia, Guinea-Bissau and Angola and Mozambique and so on. So if one looks at the struggle in South Africa, those who are considered or might be considered in some way settlers were sometimes those who were most conspicuous in their struggle against settler colonialism. So the same is true. I mean, this is a much bigger question, but the same is true in regard to Zionism. It's not a question of, people's origins or religious beliefs or anything of this kind of thing, but against an apartheid state which has been imposed and is denying people their rights and so on and so forth. And the key issue in all of these things is the question of the rights of self-determination, that people must have that right. That is a right by dint of being human and constituting a nation, that the right to govern yourself. People can't take that away. And they can't take your right to your land, your language, your culture, and all these kind of things. So I think that these things have been well articulated and considered. One can look at the writings of Fanon, one can look at the writings of Robin Sobukwe, of Mandela, there are numerous, of Amilcar Cabral. There's numerous examples of development of political theory and political ideas focusing on the nature of settler colonialism and in particular the struggle against it. So I think there's no shortage of ideas about this particular issue.
I'd like to move to after the Cold War. I mean, we talked about the development of Pan-Africanism through the period of formal decolonization and the way that took shape through the Cold War. But I'm curious if you'd be able to speak to how the collapse of the Soviet Union and the onset of the US unipolar moment, starting in the 90s with all of its attendant features like the rise of humanitarianism as a paradigm, etc. How did all of that reshape Pan-Africanism and the broader anti-imperialist movement?
Well, one way in which it changed kind of state-led Pan-Africanism was that the OAU was considered not fit for purpose in the new conditions of the 21st century, and in particular in the conditions of neoliberal globalization. So a new organization was formed, which is the African Union. And originally the African Union was conceived in different ways as a bulwark against neoliberal globalization and so on and so forth. I mean, it hasn't actually become that. Perhaps because some of its architects are no longer around because they've been assassinated by the military of the imperialist system of states and NATO and so on, but also for many other reasons. So that's one way in which it's changed. And in other ways, perhaps the struggle for the anti-imperialist movement generally is clearer than maybe it was during the bipolar division, where there was often confusion about what was the nature of the Soviet Union. There was often divisions within the anti-imperialist movement caused by affiliation or non-affiliation with the Soviet Union or with its allies and so on and so forth. So all that has gone. And as you say, we're left with not necessarily a unipolar world as far as Africa is concerned, because there's also the influence of China within Africa and the new scramble for Africa, headed by the US and China, but also involving new states, the Gulf states, Turkey, and all sorts of others. So in other words, it's become more complex. And in terms of what should the orientation be, the other development of the AU is that the AU specifically, as part of its Pan-Africanism, specifically includes the diaspora as its sixth region, although, as with other representations, the diaspora is very poorly represented in the AU. It's difficult sometimes to work out how it is represented. I think the other thing is, how does Pan-Africanism manifest itself today? Of course, we have an AU, but we also have a Pan-African movement in general terms, which is made up of non-government activists and so on. But I think one of the ways in which it manifests itself today is the global struggle for African reparations, which is kind of gathering momentum, which has the AU allied with CARICOM, the Organization of Caribbean States, as well as various non-government actors in the US, in Europe, and in other places. If we see that as probably one of the main manifestations of Pan-Africanism today, then on the one hand, it seems to be in a very strong position. On the other hand, you could say there are varying definitions of what reparations are. What does reparation mean? What is being repaired? Doesn't reparation mean not only the repair for the harm of the past, but the repair for the harm which is ongoing? And how does that going to manifest itself? And so I think that the revolutionary, to use that word, potential of the global movement for African reparations hasn't yet really come to the fore, hasn't quite fully manifested itself, but is latent, is there. We'll see how all that develops. So in a way, that shows that the strength of Pan-Africanism, even though we're in a very difficult situation in the world, where the US seems to be particularly very, very powerful, is flexing its muscles, particularly in the Caribbean, and sometimes difficult to see how the opposition to it is going to manifest itself. And yet these forces, these Pan-African forces, both governments and non-government actors, are organizing themselves. And I think that's a very interesting development, and we'll have to see how everything develops in the next few years.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, you mentioned the new scramble for Africa and the role of China on the continent in terms of various infrastructure projects, the Belt and Road Initiative, and kind of like new form of developmentalism. And I'm curious if you see, you mentioned the non-state actors and the state formations, but I'm curious if you see the rise of Chinese influence and also like Gulf actors as opening any new possibilities for African sovereignty on an economic level.
That depends. That depends who takes the opportunity and in order to do what. If you have governments that are dependent, then whether they're dependent on East or West doesn't really make too much difference. There are certainly opportunities there for governments that are people-centered and are representative of their population, but it's difficult to find such governments on the African continent, for example. We have the Alliance of Sahel States, so 3 states who may be in a position to perhaps take advantage of these contradictions between the big powers. Although at the moment they seem to be orientating themselves towards Russia, and whether that is going to become or going to be a positive course of action remains to be seen. I personally think it's dangerous to become too dependent on one power, and there's nothing particularly of Russia to recommend itself to anyone other than it has contradictions with the United States. And similarly, there's nothing necessarily to recommend China other than that it has perhaps more attractive conditions for its loans and so on, maybe, than other countries have. But it all depends on what these projects are. What project is the Alliance of Sahel States pursuing, collectively and individually? To what extent are the population of these countries involved in the decision-making that's going on? Those are the kinds of questions that I would pose. Of course, one can look at particular actions which the governments of those countries, and particularly Burkina Faso, are taking, which other states don't appear to be taking, and that only shows how backward other states are compared perhaps to those three countries. But I think the key thing for me is always the involvement of people, of popular participation in decision-making, because the military governments come to power, even with some popular support, and remain in power is always something which I think limits the projects on which they're embarking upon. So I think there are possibilities, but also there are definite dangers that need to be borne in mind.
I'm wondering if you could be more specific about the decision-making and the dangers that you see with the Alliance of Sahel States, because when I see someone like Traoré, I see someone who is certainly invoking the legacy of someone like Thomas Sankara. But he is also, he pulls France out of the country, but he's also working with the U.S. military. He recently received the Israeli ambassador for many countries around him. Where do you see him in that long legacy of Pan-Africanism?
Yeah, I haven't got to the bottom of this famous photo of Israeli ambassador. People seem to have different views as to what it means or whatever its significance is. I think that the alliance is certainly trying to do something which has some positive characteristics. They're moving away from France and so on. They have moved away from French control, which is very positive. But their association with other states, I mentioned Russia, there may well be others that are, again, that raise doubts about their project. The key thing is what kind of government is it? In whose interest does it operate? And the only way you can really judge in whose interest a government operates is what is the composition of the government and who makes the decisions in that country. Well, you can make all kinds of arguments for excluding people from decision-making power, but at the end of the day, my view is, and history, I think, supports this view, that what is the key, not just to saying, oh, this is more democratic, but actually for the strength of the governmental forms which are developing in those countries. Their strength lies in the people, in having the whole country united, having the whole country involved in the decision-making process. And so excluding people or not allowing people to involve themselves in that decision-making process is actually weakening their ability to act, making it easier for their opponents to remove them or to remove a few heads, as happened in the case of Sankara himself. So if you're looking at the kind of lessons of history, not just in Burkina Faso, but even if we look at the history of other states of Ghana, of Guinea-Bissau, of Angola, of Mozambique, we look at South Africa, all of these countries have liberated themselves by popular involvement, by people making life and death decisions and fighting for new countries in which they're empowered, they have decision-making power. And then at the end of that process of liberation, that decision-making power has been denied to them by one means or another, very often by adopting Eurocentric forms of government, which are designed to keep people away from decision-making power. So I think the fact that these military regimes haven't found a way and don't appear to be considering finding a way to involve people, and that people don't seem to have that power to make decisions, I think that's, is a worrying characteristic of these governments. They may have other very laudable characteristics, but these questions this question of democracy and empowerment, I think, are very important. As I say, not taking those steps, I think, weakens their project, weakens their ability to govern and to resist the interference of the big powers. So those are my concerns.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hakim Adi, this has been a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much for your invaluable work and scholarship and for taking the time to speak with us today.
You're very welcome. Anytime.